the 1920s, when ballet was a young dance form in the United States, aspiring dancers of color had no choice but to study either in segregated settings or as private students of prominent white teachers, willing to take them. The first black ballet dancers worked as janitors, elevator operators, and housewives, and came to their lessons after a hard day on the job, many traveling long miles across town on a streetcar or bus before an evening of strenuous dancing. African Americans in ballet had a very, very, very long road, and they still do. After this presentation, I want to discuss these 6 concepts. I'm talking about American ballet in particular versus European ballet. And I'm also talking about African Americans inside of American ballet. So the 6 ideas or concepts or questions are thus: is ballet based on aesthetics, beauty, culture, race, identity, communication, or movement? 2, beauty as a sensation, not a visible identity. It's a quote from Tommy DeFrance. 3, what are the expectations of the ballet patron? 4, since kinetic vocabulary, dance, resides as a primary language and foundational practice within most Black communities, and those same communities tend toward inclusion and bricolage, how does ballet serve as a discourse for African Americans? 5, Alonso believes there is a theory of Africanist consciousness inside the epistemological constructs of ballet. Do you agree? Why or why not? And the last one, 6, how do African Americans, Mexican, Chinese, or Japanese Americans approach the performance of beauty? We're going to talk about these 6 concepts at the end. While Hemsley Winfield's new Negro Art Theater group was not a ballet company, its performance proved that Black dancers performing in non-stereotypical shake or, quote, primitive, unquote, or vernacular dance modalities could be accepted by largely white audiences. And this is important. We'll talk about this particular recital much more when we get to modern dance. But it's important to note that the Black body on stage in concert dance is a palette that European Americans had to grow into and still do. Eugene von Rona, who is a son of a white American mother and a German father, he forms a ballet company in the United States. He trains in Germany with Mary Wigman before moving to the United States in 1925. He ran an ad in the Amsterdam News, which was the newspaper of New York. New York used to be called New Amsterdam, offering free dance lessons at the Harlem YMCA. He chose 30 aspiring students out of 150 students who applied for those positions. In 1937, a Black ballet company, the American Negro Ballet, made its debut at the Lafayette Theater in Harlem to a live orchestration. Although the premiere was a critical and popular success, the American Negro Ballet survived for barely a year before its demise in 1938. In 1939, von Grona renamed the company American Swing Ballet to appear in Lou Leslie's Blackbirds of 1939. We're going to talk about that particular play, Blackbirds of 1939, that I think that von Grona was trying to contextualize the Black dancing body on stage to match the perceptions of what the audience expected out of the Black dancing body. And he was trying to, at the same time, train his dancers and have performance venues for them. Now, prior to von Grona's particular company and training, Katherine Denham opened a school in the 1930s. She was teaching in Chicago. A little bit later, in 1931, she forms Ballet Negra, which holds its first and only performance in Chicago. They disband quite quickly. Denham went on to eventually create the first African-American modern dance company. Now, there were very, very few venues for African American ballet and modern trained dancers. Here's one I'm listing, but it's literally a handful. 1934, Four Saints in Three Acts. It was groundbreaking for its form. It was an opera by American composer Virgil Thompson with a libretto by Gertrude Stein. It was written between 1927 and 1928. It was also groundbreaking in that it had an all-black cast with singers directed by a black choral director, Ava Jesse, supported by her choir. You can see the choir in the background at the top. Again, very few venues. It kind of reminds me of House of Flowers. When House of Flowers came out, dancers from all over the country, including Alvin Ailey and Carmen de Lavalade and Geoffrey Holder, came out to perform in this particular play. It was a venue in which concert dancers could strut their technique. Now, I'm going to jump back to Russia for a moment. And when I say back, those of you just watching this particular presentation, I haven't talked about Russia at all, but in class we've talked about the dances of Russia, Marius Petipa and his development of classical ballet in the Imperial Theater of Russia, and how he devised a tremendous amount of innovations in ballet, and specifically classical ballet. The person to follow him, not necessarily a choreographer, he's not a dancer, but he was an impresario, was Sergei Diaghilev. Sergei Diaghilev hired Michael Fokine out of Ballet Russe out of the Imperial Theater to help him form Ballet Russe, be the head choreographer. An individual by the name of George Balanchine is watching this, comes from the history of Marius Petipa, is watching Michael Fokine and what he is doing in the 1910, 1912, 1913 performances in his choreography. George Balanchine eventually becomes the choreographer for Ballet Russe. There he choreographs Apollo, 1928. He also choreographs Prodigal Son in 1929. In 1929, Diaghilev dies, and the company is turned over to two other individuals who kind of say, we will carry on this message, carry on this sort of art, and they form the Ballet Russe de Monte Carlo. George Balanchine performs for them or choreographs for them. Lincoln Kirstein sees George Balanchine in these performances and sees his work, and he writes a passionate letter in 1933, Lincoln Kirstein was a scholar, ballet patron, and impresario. He's a writer and a dance historian. He writes a letter introducing a man named George Balanchine to a friend of his. He wants to create a dream, to remake ballet for America. The plan, as Kirstein wrote, was to have 4 white girls and 4 white boys, about 16 years of age, and 8 of the same Negroes. Now, unfortunately, Kirstein's plan for student diversity was never realized. And while others have made inroads in classical ballet, the complicated reality of racial inequity persisted, especially for Black women. Now, Kirstein launched a revolution to overthrow the well-entrenched Russian ballet to form an American ballet. He opened up the American school, it's called American Ballet School, and then plus the American Ballet Company in 1934. George Balanchine was part of this. Yeah, they also started Ballet Caravan in 1936, 1941, with American themes of modernism, jazz, and vaudeville. Lou Christensen choreographed Filling Station, Eugene Loring choreographed Billy the Kid, and William Dollar, Air and Variations. They formed Ballet Society in 1946, they meaning Lincoln Kirstein and various funders in 1946. And then it became New York City Ballet much, much later. But before 1946, before Ballet Society, between 1936 and 1943, George Balanchine choreographed for Broadway and the silver screen for film, earning needed income while providing work for the dancers that he was training at the school. Among his many, many theater projects were On Your Toes, And inside of On Your Toes, he choreographed this famous ballet sequence, The Slaughter on 10th Avenue, I Married an Angel, and The Goldwyn Follies. Balanchine also choreographed stage works for Ballet Russe de Monte Carlo during this time, including The Night Shadow. He also choreographs, or is said to, I'm going to put choreography in quotes, A Cabin in the Sky. At several dance conferences, I've heard mentioned that sometimes he would walk in, give the dancers a theme, and the dancers themselves would actually flesh out the choreography. During this time period, I think that Balanchine is honing his craft, honing how he is going to think about the ballet idiom inside of America. His work becomes highly articulated. The torso becomes highly articulated. He has polycentrism, two or more centers operating at the same time, polyrhythms, asymmetry, radical juxtapositioning or lack of transitions, isolations, syncopations, use of speed, use of the turned in leg, and his particular use of the floor. And while early on he did not get his dream to bring in 4 white girls, 4 white boys of 16 years of age, and the same of combination in Negroes, he eventually was able to bring in African Americans into the company, of course. Arthur Mitchell is one of them. Marie Tallchief is another, who eventually became his wife. Another individual of European descent who forms the company, the first Negro classic ballet, is Josef Ricard. The first Negro classic ballet is going to be called several different names. I'm not going to go through all of the names, kind of like New York City Ballet has many names throughout its incarnation. The first Negro classic ballet is directed by a German immigrant, Josef Ricard. It's going to premiere in Los Angeles in the group's first recital in 1947 at an auditorium, and it was at the Danish Auditorium on the West 24th Street, and was the first to present a complete repertoire on point. Now, initially called a Ballet Americana and Hollywood Ballet, Josef Ricard, his company would bring his dancers to New York, and his company combined with Lord Fleming's New York Negro Ballet. Josef Ricard's troupe was not the first black ballet corps, but it built on the accomplishments of its predecessor, the American Negro Ballet, founded in New York in 1937. We just talked about that. Both companies set the stage for the dance theater of Harlem. Now, beginning their training late in life, many African American dancers could not achieve the technical ease and proficiency of younger students. But the choreographers, like Ricard and Balanchine in a way, was particularly gifted in teaching older students, and with this genius for choreographing dance sequences that relied on narrative and acting abilities rather than only technique. And this, I'm talking about Josef Ricard, not so much George Balanchine. He was able to emphasize the strengths of his dancers. Agnes DeMille. You probably want me to slow down a little bit, right? Agnes DeMille, born in New York and grew up in California. She traveled to London and trained with Ballet Rambert. In 1940, she joined Ballet Theater and choreographed Ballet Ritual. In 1941, also 3 Angels and a Devil. In 1943, she's going to create Rodeo for the Ballet Russe de Monte Carlo. She returned to the United States and choreographed Oklahoma in 1943, Brigadoon in 1947, Gentlemen Prefer Blondes in 1949, and Paint Your Wagon in 1950. So we'll definitely talk about her when we get to jazz. She created dances that were integral to the development of the plot. So in other words, the dance was not just a divertissement or a diversion. The plot continued through the dance. She developed what is going to be called an American style in ballet, and she has tons of lectures and writings which educated American audiences about dance. Now, let's get back to the Negro unit of ballet theater, or the New York Ballet Theater, which is going to become ABT in 1957. The opening season of ballet theater in 1940 included a Negro unit, which presented one work, Ballet Ritual, choreographed by Agnes DeMille, and performed by a cast of 16 women to a score by Marius Milhaud. The dancers had received training in the Negro wing of the ballet school. I understand that there was also a Spanish wing to the school. In the next year, she's going to choreograph Four Marys. And this is the piece that you see here on the right. Training. We have the Negro unit of the ballet school theater, but we're going to have people who are going to attend the ballet school, like Balanchine's ballet school, and they're going to come out and realize that there is nowhere in the 1930s and 40s for African Americans to perform or to continue to train. And in comes the Jones Hayward School of Dance, formed or established in 1941 by two dance pioneers. It is known today as JHDAS, was founded expressly to give minority children an opportunity to study classical ballet. In 1961, they formed a dance company called Capital Black in Washington, D.C., or Capital Ballet, created in 1961 as the performing unit of the Jones Hayward School. It invited many distinguished African American dancers and choreographers to be guest artists. Chita Rivera's mother, so not only African American, but Latin American and Asian American parents enrolled their students into this particular school. So Chita Rivera's mother enrolled her in the Jones Hayward School of Ballet. Later, when Chita was 15, a teacher from George Balanchine's School of American Ballet visited the studio, and Chita was one of the two students picked to audition in New York City. She was accompanied to the audition by Doris Jones. Chita's audition was successful, and she was accepted into the school and given a scholarship by George Balanchine. Among her new teachers were the great Allegra Kent and Maria Tallchief. Now, the other thing I forgot to say about this school is that Arthur Mitchell would frequently come to the school and teach. And Arthur Mitchell also said that George Balanchine would come and give master classes to Doris Jones and Clay Hayward in his particular technique. Dance Theater of Harlem. I remember earlier I talked about George Balanchine was able eventually in 1956, which is much, much later than he had wanted. He was able to bring in a dancer by the name of Arthur Mitchell. And Arthur Mitchell joined the company, New York City Ballet, in 1956. This company was extraordinarily successful for Arthur Mitchell. He succeeded in breaking bounds and breaking the color line. I remember stories of people or the dancers not wanting to dance with Arthur Mitchell, or their parents not wanting Arthur Mitchell to dance with Arthur Mitchell. The parents of the European American students or dancers not wanting their daughters to dance with Arthur Mitchell. And George Balanchine was like, well, then you can take your daughter out of the school or you can leave the company, but basically he's staying. In 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated, and it shocked the world and shook the world, including Arthur Mitchell. And as I heard him say, he was not one to riot. He was not one to walk the streets with banners and with a fist in the air and talking about the inequities in this country. He was a dancer, and he was a choreographer, and he knew that was his strength. And in 1969, he forms Dance Theater of Harlem as his protest, his artistic protest. In so doing, Balanchine 100% supported Arthur Mitchell, and allowed Dance Theater of Harlem to not only do the repertory of his works, like Apollo and Serenade, but also the Russian lineage. He helped him do reset some of the Russian lineage dance, like Patakat, on his company. And also there's a man by the name of Karl Shake, who is the artistic director at the Balanchine School and the Balanchine Company, and he left with Arthur Mitchell to help Arthur Mitchell co-found Dance Theater of Harlem. Here we have DTH dancers and Firebird, that's Abney, and Streetcar Named Desire, and Every Now and Then. Earlier dancers, Janet Collins, prima ballerina at the Metropolitan Opera House in 1951, so this is pre-Dance Theater of Harlem, of course. Janet Collins would become the first black premier dancer in the Metropolitan Opera Ballet, and in 1954, the Ballet Russe de Monte Carlo would accept its first black ballerina. Yes, Janet Collins. Janet was born in New Orleans and began her career in vaudeville and was a member of the original Katherine Denham troupe. She also danced with Lester Horton until 1948. Another major dancer that you saw a film about her as your homework is Raven Wilkinson. So I won't go into her particular lineage and her history, but just to acknowledge that she is a major contributor to African Americans on the stage, demonstrating the beauty and the aesthetic of American ballet. Because much of American society was segregated, many ballet studios would not accept black students. Some of these teachers took or sent advanced students to New York or Europe to further study, often with scholarship money raised in the local community. You saw this in the film. Marion Suchet took a group of dancers to New York to study. And at first, of course, they were not received by the fellow dancers, by the fellow students in the school, and eventually they would after the first week. But many times it would be a light-skinned African American that would go and take class, bring that information back to her studio or back to her students. It's how many African Americans trained in ballet. The great Dolores Brown, you saw the movie about her, the little clip about her, was also a soloist with Ballet Americana. She was born in Philadelphia and started dancing at 14. Now, another dancer that I love talking about is Louis Johnson. He also was a dancer at the Balanchine School with Arthur Mitchell. He was a major choreographer. In fact, I remember being at a black dance conference and him talking about his choreography and his contributions to American dance, especially with the Ailey Company. He also talked about the fact that not many people know that he was at the school with Arthur Mitchell at the same time. Other dancers who brought their magnificent artistry and helped to bridge that gap of watching African Americans on stage, not in primitive quotes, not in a shake situation or in a vernacular situation, were John Jones of the Robert Joffrey Company. Also, he danced in Jerome Robbins' ballet, Afternoon of a Faun. Would have loved to have seen that version. Another dancer is Keith Lee in the Harkness Ensemble. Of course, we have the great Carmen de Lavallade, who trained with many individuals, including Lester Horton, danced with Lester Horton, along with Alvin Ailey. Both of them danced there. Her husband, Geoffrey Holder, who has choreographed a tremendous amount, and you can see his choreography in Broadway plays, in Broadway plays, and in fine art concert dance. We're going to watch, when I get to you guys, we're going to watch this particular video, Joan Myers Brown and the Audacious Hope of the Black Ballerina. Joan Myers Brown is on the left, and one of my Mentors from afar. She's not a direct mentor, but definitely a mentor from afar is Brenda Dixon Gottschild. She's on the left. She's the one who wrote the book, Joan Myers Brown and the Audacious Hope of the Black Ballerina. And we will watch this particular video when I see you, or maybe I'll pump it in this. So now we're going to be back. We are back to the 6 different concepts or questions I want to discuss. So I'll stop the recording here.